It is time now for our keynote speaker, much awaited session, and we are delighted to welcome the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, QPM. I'll tell you a little bit about him before we invite him on stage. Sir Mark is actually a Brummie, and so a very warm Midlands welcome to him, and very nice to see him on home turf. He was educated at Handsworth Grammar School. He studied at Cambridge and then began his policing career in 1987 by joining West Midlands Police as a constable. His career in policing spans over 30 years, during which time he's transformed national security and policing, and his career has taken him across the country. He became Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police last year. He was sworn in on the 12th of September, so exactly a year ago. And it's not bad considering Sir Mark said he would retire in 2018. Now, we know it's a challenging time for policing, but in particular for the Metropolitan Police. So we are delighted that he's made the time and he's with us today. Would you please give a very warm welcome to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, QPM. Hi, Mark. Over to you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you all, leaders of the service as you are, to discuss the challenges of today. So I know we've got time for question and answer, so I'll speak maybe for 15 minutes and then we'll get a chance to debate the issues I've got on my list, and I'm sure you've got some on your list. It's a humbling responsibility to be appointed as Commissioner. Humbling for two reasons, really. Humbling when I see day in and day out what officers confront and deal with, and humbling when I think about the expectations of the public and what we need to do to meet those. Examples of both of them have struck me just in the last few days. Humbling in terms of officers' efforts, the recapture of escaped suspected terrorist Khalif last weekend was an extraordinary example of policing at its best. I don't think there's anywhere else in the world where we can join together national security, counter-terrorism policing, local policing, specialists across multiple forces. I mean, forces such as Thames Valley and Kent did immense amounts of work. And what's missed in these cases is local policing carried more of the burden and effort than the specialists who were at the centre of the investigation. And of course, that local policing relationship meant that we had many calls from members of the public which were helpful in bringing him back behind bars. The second example is about the humbling in terms of communities. So like many forces around the country, we're looking at the way we can bring organised crime assets together with community policing teams to deal with the highest crime neighbourhoods. The clear hold build strategy, as it's been termed. We were talking publicly last week about an estate in Barnet, which has been one of our higher crime areas for some time. That first phase of work has led to 160 arrests in 8 weeks, and I could give lots of facts and figures over that. But the most interesting thing is when a journalist is out doing their vox pops to see how it's going, and we all know how much we worry about journalists doing vox pops, because who knows who they're going to end up speaking to, ends up speaking to a young mum who says, I've been asked the question, what's it like around here? What do you think how the police are doing? That sort of question. I said, well, it's fantastic. It's changed dramatically. For the first time since I've lived here, I feel able to let my kids play outside. That's far more powerful than any statistic, isn't it? And it goes to our responsibility to communities. Now, I returned after 4.5 years out of policing, sort of relaxed, a bit of private sector consultancy, working with some charities, writing a thriller with a mate. A bizarre sort of portfolio of things to come back into policing. I didn't think I was ever going to be doing this, but I realised I still have the same sense of vocation I had when I joined 36 years ago, which is a depressing statistic that someone has already reminded us of. The thing that captures me and drives me about this moment of reform is our heritage of policing by consent, how it's dented, sorely dented in an ever more contested world, And I think the prize that we all have to wrestle with today, above everything else, is reinventing how we deliver policing by consent in a digitised 21st century nation. The same mission we had 200 years ago when Peel and others started writing it down, but the delivery needs to be different. And whilst looking at reform, of course, we've had a busy year. We've had 2 extraordinary ceremonials, which the whole country sort of pulled behind in terms of policing and were fantastic operations. We've been dealing with extraordinary levels of protest, prolonged and sustained, and changing the legislation in that area. We've been taking the first steps of reform, which I'll come back to in a minute. As we've been taking those steps, we've had others helping us, and we had the Louise Case report published in March on that vein. And meanwhile, day-to-day policing turns over. So we now get 13,300 contacts and calls every day in London. So that volume of business grows at 8%, and that's going on in the background as we think about how do we do better for communities. So why is reform needed? I think it's worth reflecting on our mission. Certainly, I think in my career, we started with the policing has always been about the public space. It's always been about safety and order in the public space, violence and acquisitive crime, etc. Over the last sort of decades, we've recognised that the volume of crime that takes place often in private, predatory and exploitative crimes have been hidden under the surface, and increasingly those have been lifted. And it's fantastic the amount of extra confidence that's generated, massive uplifts in reporting in issues like rape and domestic violence over the last decade, but that's stretching us and challenging us. And then there's a third area of operation, which is online, cyber, fraud, etc., where we're really struggling to get significant resources into that. So our mission has widened from that one area to those 3. But it's also become more blurred. What are the police for? You'll sort of heard me talk about some of the things we've been doing in London, picking up the excellent work in Humberside around mental health and sort of finding the right balance where police are doing what we're skilled at and others can do what they're skilled at. It's also about community expectations. We're in a world where trust in authority is going down generally. The benchmarks, I think, are harder and harder to achieve. Our community's trust and confidence in the Metropolitan Police has gone down significantly in the last 4 or 5 years. And yet we are still sort of slightly above average in terms of the national surveys. So it's a challenge for all of us. We have big challenges, don't we, in terms of just the volume of business and sort of the volume of work we've got growing, the money in the system and funding and how efficient we are. And then very visibly, we haven't spent enough time on basics like keeping a grip of our integrity, and we've seen some of the awful cases that have arisen with people who shouldn't have been in the job. So in that context, I've set our mission for the next, for my commissionership, and it's very deliberately 6 words: more trust, less crime and high standards. There's 2 significant things for me in that I want to stress. Putting trust on the top line alongside crime. I think too often in policing, the community aspect has been made secondary. I can think of sort of politicians and senior police officers who've reduced policing to it's just about fighting crime. It has to be about building trust alongside that. Those 2 things sit alongside each other. You fight crime most effectively if you have trust and good relationships with communities. The trust and the increasing trust and the reducing crime feed off each other. So making that really clear as part of what we're aiming at. And then having high standards on the top line. That's not something you want to do as a commissioner or a chief or maybe a BCU commander. I'm sure there are many in the room leading a large body of men and women. But we have slipped up. There are systemic failings in how we've protected our integrity, and we need to put it on the top line because we need to show the public we get it, we're changing how we operate, and we're repairing those errors. So that's what's behind that mission. So given that's not what we're delivering, we've got 3 themes for transforming. Starting sort of inside and working out. I think the foundations of policing have been stretched and damaged over the last decade. They certainly have in the Met. I think sort of financial pressures created that, as sort of a determination to try and keep as strong a front line as possible in terms of numbers, I think has weakened some of the underpinnings. Whether we look at training of our front line, whether we're looking at training of leaders, whether we look at equipment, whether we look at buildings and estates, there are weaknesses underneath which we need to face up to and confront and build the evidence basis for why that's critical with our funders. As part of that, the technology question I think is critical. Working with technology companies when I was outside policing, the hunger out there to reinvent the way work is done is enormous. And we can all think of different sectors we engage with as citizens and how those experiences have changed over the last 10 or 20 years, shopping being an obvious example, but there's lots of examples. We haven't done that reinvention ourselves, and we need to, and it will only come through technology. I think sort of the work we've started to do using sort of clever data science to take out of all of our violence against women and girls offenders and identify the top 100 offenders. Bear in mind, just last year there were over 30,000 men had allegations made against them in London of rape, domestic violence, harassment, etc. How do you find the most dangerous in that and use the same methodology with counter-terrorism or gangs? That's what we're doing with data. Facial recognition, live facial recognition and retrospective, the potential for that to reinvent, I think, investigations is comparable to what we saw sort of 20, 30 years ago with DNA. So we've got to fix our foundations. They got damaged during austerity, and our people stand on them. One part of that is leadership training and development. A parallel that I've thought about and sort of researched. So chief superintendents, often leading sort of units of 1,000 or 2,000 people, massive responsibilities, comparable to a colonel in the military. A colonel since Sandhurst, so since they passed out as a captain, a colonel since Sandhurst in the army, has had 72 weeks leadership development through their maybe 15 or 20 years to reach colonel. I think in most forces, people going to chief superintendent, if they've had 3 or 4 weeks of leadership development, they're very, very lucky. That is a crazy gap given the roles that we're asking of people. So that training is absolutely critical. Standards and culture is the second thing. So I'll talk about fixing foundations, standards and culture. There's 2 parts to this, and it's very easy for public reporting to focus on what I've termed the hundreds who shouldn't be in the organisation that we haven't confronted and dealt with. But healthy organisations, about the tens of thousands who come to work committed and dedicated with that sense of vocation, and how supported they feel, how equipped, how trained, how well led they are, how we bring a strong culture to life that is inclusive and enables everyone to thrive in an organisation where there is too much discrimination. We've thought about the value statements in the organisation, and we think they were too ethereal, too impractical, and we're clear now that we've got 5 clear principles that we're wiring into all of our decision-making, promotion, selection, training, and those are about putting communities first, being frontline focused, being inclusive, we have to become anti-discriminatory, being collaborative, and being precise. And I'm seeing ways that those decisions are changing the way we operate, not least in leadership decisions where we need to select leaders who are both operationally competent but also live the values, something I don't think we've always done. Alongside that sits dealing with the negative side of the culture and standards issue and rooting out those in the organisation that shouldn't be there. I'm not going to make any new announcements about that. That's what we've been working on. We're making good progress on it. The changes in regulations that government are doing are critical, and we've got a building backlog created by the current process. But I'm confident we will get through that, but it will be a painful journey, as it always is when you lift the stone and confront issues that haven't been confronted for some time. At the front end, we're terming it community crime fighting. How do we fight crime with communities? At the base of that is strengthening neighbourhood policing. We want the strongest neighbourhood policing we've ever had in London. That's going to be a difficult journey. We've got 1,600 police and community support officers than we had before. But we're reshaping how we operate to make that the foundation of our policing, and not just in terms of the dedicated experts, but how they have calls on the rest of the Met to support them at serving their communities. So the organisation is more influenced by what communities need and less influenced from Scotland Yard, getting that balance right of top down and bottom up. So community crime fighting, culture and standards, and fixing foundations is how we're going to achieve that. In the last year we've made plenty of progress, but there's a hell of a journey ahead. I'll give you stats about sort of shootings and murders being down, burglary being down, antisocial behaviour concern falling. We can talk about how, I know, compared to many European cities, on things like murder, we've got a sort of very sort of reasonable and comparable track record compared to places, even like compared to Toronto or New York, we're half the murder rate of Toronto, and New York is 3.5 times greater. So we're a safe city, but there's more to do. Violence against women and girls is something that we haven't put enough investment in over the last decade as the demand has gone up. We've started to address that, and our rape detections have gone from bottom quarter in the country to in the top quarter. Nationally, we're not good enough, but at least we're making progress. So we're making progress in many respects as we start to sort of build trust and drive down crime. So in my view, we have to be absolutely determined about reform because of that dent we see across the country in policing by consent. It's not broken as some would want to have it, but it is sorely dented, and if we don't confront it, the danger is over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that heritage, that unique thing about our policing could become irrecoverable. We have to turn that round now. But alongside our zeal, determination, passion for policing, our determination to reform, I think we need some help from others. I've talked about funding, stretch on mission, the need for us to be precise about how we operate. We all think about precision in terms of tactics, don't we, in terms of who are the most dangerous criminals, where are the hotspots we should target resources, about how do we protect the most vulnerable individuals and communities. But I think we need to think about precision in policy as well. And I think there's too many ways blurring has led to making it harder and harder for our frontline men and women, police officers, call handlers, PCSOs, to do the job they want to do. I think we need to let the police police. I've got 3 examples of this I want to illustrate before I wrap up. So, the first example, I mentioned the blurred mission. I think tackling, sort of copying the great work in Humberside and sort of starting to tackle the balance of responsibilities for mental health and other social care responsibilities is the first step. But there are boundary issues that we have to focus on our role, both because we're not the right resource for those people in moments of distress. They should have a professional rather than an enthusiastic, caring police officer who's not skilled in that area, but also because as much as we're doing that, we're not serving the public in terms of building trust and driving down crime. Our policy on that goes live on the 1st of November, and having put a deadline in, frustrated at 10 years of negotiation around this in London, I'm pleased the way the NHS have come to the table and been really constructive. So that's the first point. The second one was about bureaucracy. We don't pay enough attention to the practicalities of day-to-day operations for officers and what it looks like from their perspective. On one bit of research that we had done, it looks like the investigation of a crime, the prosecution of a crime for police and CPS is taking at least 5 times as much effort as it took 20 years ago. I'm sure many of you have sat down with a detective or a young constable who's putting a file together in the last couple of years. When I see what they're putting together, for the most simple of cases, it's a sort of, in those simple of cases, if you printed it off, it's a ring binder. I know, I've done it, I've tried it. It's cases that when I was dealing with 30 years ago, to get it to charge, it was about 10 sheets of paper. I'm not saying what we did then was perfect, but it's just burgeoned out of all belief as the expectations of sort of lawyerly activity for police in terms of disclosure and redaction regimes, which in many jurisdictions are done by lawyers, not police officers, and the pushing of every requirement to the front end of the process so that pretty much every file's a not guilty file is unreasonable. And if you make investigation and prosecution 5 times more expensive, you get a lot less of it. However determined people are, we have to challenge these issues and work with partners and government to reset the frame to make it more deliverable. The third area I wanted to mention was what I think is for our good frontline officer, for the tens of thousands who are out there confronting difficult and dangerous issues, what is dispiriting and discouraging oversight. This may seem at odds with me talking sort of predeterminedly about the hundreds who shouldn't be in the organisation, but how does it look if you're one of the tens of thousands of good officers confronting difficult people? I'll give you a couple of examples. So, sadly, many people we come across in policing and arrest for crimes are vulnerable, sick, they've got illness issues, health issues, substance abuse issues. There are often complex health issues, aren't there? Our officers are so careful about that. If there's any risk about that, there's a medical professional doing an assessment. Sometimes a casualty before they go into custody, sometimes in custody, say, is this person fit to be detained? And so we only proceed with a green light. A few hours later, if that person dies in custody, a massive investigation lands on top of those officers for not spotting something, in theory, that medical professionals weren't able to spot. That is massively dispiriting, I think, if you're just trying to do your best. I look at pursuits. I'm not sure there's any other jurisdiction in the world where a police officer engaging in a pursuit, as long as he or she is sort of appropriately professional and careful about their own driving and their own behaviour so they don't put the public at risk themselves, I'm not sure of any other jurisdiction in the world where if the offender does something stupid or rash or reckless, a massive investigation descends on the officer. When did we decide to discourage officers from pursuing criminals? For me, it seems perverse. And I think there's a lack of fairness in the system from IOPC and CPS, and juries can see it. We've looked back at pursuit rate charges over the last few years in London, and the officers put to court, juries have convicted less than 30% of them. Bear in mind, the normal threshold for CPS charging is a realistic prospect of conviction, and the normal conviction rate is 80% across the whole range of crimes. So it looks like a different threshold applies to our officers, and they can feel that individually, and when I speak to them, these issues make them anxious about doing their job. So I think that combination of factors, a blurred mission, bureaucracy and dispiriting oversight, are things that we as leaders need to challenge. Some elements of those are in our gift, and we need to be much stronger at setting policy and frameworks where we protect our people who are making difficult decisions, but also, as you'll see from those areas, there's more we need from others to help the majority of our people who are good men and women succeed as we lead the reforms that are in our hands of the service, which are desperately necessary. So, to conclude, this is, I think, a generational moment of reform for policing. That combination of changing expectations, widening mission, tight finances, and sort of failures on standards means that we have to really face into that as a service. I think we have to be brutally clear that for the foreseeable future, the top line is about trust, crime and standards. All three of them have to be there. We have to drive this reform. Most of it is in our gift. But just as we should be challenging and frank and demanding of ourselves, we need to be equally demanding of others where they can help us succeed, such as in the areas I've illustrated there, where I think others' policies are contributing to officers, the pressure on officers in their roles, and the need for us to allow the police to police. Thank you.